Look at that there. Look at, yeah, do it, yeah, with back baby. Yeah, the Terminator. I'm back, baby. I'm rusty on my Arnold Schwarzenegger. Um, yes, despite all sense, common or otherwise, I am back. And today, as promised, I am going to do a little digging into Jack Kirby and specifically the New Gods. But before we get started with that, there's two things I want to do. One is I want to make it clear to everybody that this will not always be a Jack Kirby show. The stuff I'm about to try to present to you guys is kind of born out of an interest of rereading a bunch of Kirby comics back during the pandemic. So I had to kind of cram in order to put this show together. Fortunately or unfortunately, that decision was based on having some dealer's choice of art reward tiers. I sound like Scooby-Doo. Art reward tiers that I had drawn on actual paper, like this Orion piece that you're about to see. So those two things kind of, formed a confluence and made this kind of a readily available topic for the show. As I mentioned, that Kickstarter, just really briefly, thanks again to everyone that supported in any way, shape, or form, whether that be your hard-earned cash or your vocal support or pat on the back or, just following me, whatever it is. I give you the Michael Jordan speech and be like, even the people that hated me, you were the coal, you're shoveling coal into my engine. Super Ego, 176 pages of superhero satire and slice of life. I did every possible job and more on this comic. I wrote, drew, colored, designed, basically birthed it into this world. Kicking and screaming. And though the campaign has closed, if this does interest you at all, I will be leaving the campaign open while I do some organizational stuff to try and get these books printed and shipped and ordered. So late pledges are still open and you can still secure a copy of the book for a very limited time. If you could see all the notes in front of me, you would understand why I'm about to do what I'm about to do, which is, per usual, I have already made kind of a short draw video on this topic. This one's a little bit longer than normal, but I am going to let it play concurrently with the live drawing stream. So hopefully it'll, hold everybody's attention. I think this information is pretty vital to some of the more in-depth unpacking I want to do for the rest of the time we're here tonight. So if you'll bear with me, it's only about 8 minutes long. I think it's pretty good. Your mileage may vary. But I'll be right back.
By the mid-1960s, the superheroes Jack Kirby had worked for 3 decades to define were finally thriving at Marvel Comics. But the creative energies which pushed Kirby would not stand still in success. As his work grew more self-actualized, it began to chafe at the demands of commerce and genre. The success of 1966's Galactus trilogy galvanized Kirby's ambitions. His long run on Thor had repurposed myths distant and removed, but Galactus and his Herald the Silver Surfer opened Kirby's eyes to the potential of creating gods of his own. By most accounts, Stan Lee seemed to pick up what Kirby was putting down, but argued that a new title full of uncut Kirby mythology would melt more brains than opening the Ark of the Covenant. So any new pantheon would have to be soft-launched into existing series like Thor, a character whom Lee argued should remain unchanged. This grated at Kirby. Most of the Marvel Universe began at Jack's drafting board, telling the stories he saw fit with art and notes in the margins. How could Stan, or anyone, have the audacity to ask him to rein in the creative ambition that built the House of Ideas? Stan's reason, of course, was business. specifically that of an in-production Thor cartoon. One that it turns out offered Kirby no input, consent, or royalty. And if that insult wasn't bad enough, injury soon followed. In Lee and artist John Buscema's Silver Surfer #1, which cut Kirby's plans for one of his most personal characters off at the knees. Burned for the last time, Kirby slowly withdrew until such time as he could find greener pastures. He'd keep his good ideas to and for himself. But by 1968, that was a moot point, as Lee's uncle, Martin Goodman, sold Marvel to the so evil-sounding you couldn't make it up Perfect Film and Chemical Corporation. Believing him to be every bit the solitary genius they'd read about, Stan was promoted, while a curt phone call offered Kirby a take-it-or-leave-it deal. Jack hung up the phone and called DC Comics' new art director Carmine Infantino. Ragnarok had finally arrived. It is unclear whether DC Comics acquired Jack Kirby for the merit of his work, or as a strategy to weaken their rivals at Marvel. But for Kirby, this was no rebound love affair. As artist, editor, and writer, Kirby would at last voice his own work, an entire line of it, on which he was eager to experiment with new publishing formats, new genres, and most vitally, stories that could challenge the perpetual tidiness of the superhero status quo. Yet for all the stars in his eyes, Kirby knew his new bosses wanted his boots firmly on the ground. He decided his first job would be the only existing DC title that wouldn't steal anyone else's. With its cloning labs, Don Rickles cameos, and tiny monster movie worshipping planets, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen would plant the odd, inventive, and experimental seeds of Kirby's new gods. But Superman's inclusion meant oversight. The faces redrawn to match the corporate model were the first of many frustrating, bureaucratic paper cuts. Still, with 3 more interwoven bi-monthly titles to add to his Fourth World saga, he didn't have time to bleed. In the Forever People, Kirby saw the new teen gods he'd envisioned to replace the pantheon of Thor find a new life. In Mr. Miracle, he channeled his feelings of confinement to the comics industry into an exiled escape artist, and the love for his wife Roz into the armor of the unconquerable Big Barda. But perhaps most importantly, there was New Gods. With his Ragnarok finally realized, Kirby consolidated, entangled, and re-envisioned the very nature of good and evil. Raised in the paradise of New Genesis as the greatest weapon of a peaceful society, his Orion is the secret son of great and terrible Darkseid, a haunted outcast forced to hide his true face in nature. A soldier whose capacity for war is both a grim burden and a violent thrill. If Captain America was how Kirby prepared for war, Orion was how he intended to reckon with it. Unshackled, uncut, direct from the source, Kirby delivered an abstracted, operatic visual and written language, designed to somehow both distill and transcend reality. The cosmic Kirby enthusiasm to the Fantastic Four's Seinfeld. But for some, the Fourth World is almost too imaginative, too inventive, and as Kirby would soon find out, too ambitious. For the more than 100 issues under Kirby and Lee, the Fantastic Four had a reassuring tone and consistency that guided and connected with its audience. But upon moving to DC Comics, Kirby was eager to shake things up, to finally fill his own dialogue balloons, and more than anything, to escape the doom he saw lurking for comics. Kirby hoped his collected New Gods saga would help pave the way for singular volume comics, for stories that were allowed to grow, change, and end. But critically, his initial effort was met with mixed reactions. Bearing no more relation to everyday conversation than his mind-bending design sense, Kirby's emotional, operatic dialogue spoke directly to many. But those who expected a Marvel comic under a different publishing banner seemed lost. Mounting editorial micro-incursions exacerbated the issue, as what was expected now arm-wrestled with what could be. A major blow to the latter came when Kirby's plans to hand off art chores to a hand-picked staff fell apart. As more work fell on Kirby's shoulders, so too did the growing sense that he was stuck in the middle of crafting a novel he wasn't allowed to finish. Rather than let the audience build organically, DC's outsized expectations had caused them to push print runs as high as their top-selling title, Superman. A move further complicated when surging print costs spurred DC to raise the prices to 25 cents. That hard-earned blood nickel more than Marvel's cover price hit Kirby's 4 interconnected titles hardest. So when DC's bean counters blamed the losses on the complexity of the series, the writing was on the wall. In 1972, Forever People, and the New Gods were cancelled. The more isolated and superheroic Mr. Miracle survived until 1974, but despite his premature death, the impact of Kirby's New Gods reverberated throughout late 20th century pop culture. And though both titles would soon return separately, those of you following the story closely could probably already guess that it ain't over, even when it's over. Following the cancellation of New Gods, a disappointed but undiluted Jack Kirby did his best to keep DC Comics a happy home. But ultimately, even creations like the Demon, Kamandi, and Omak weren't enough to keep him from sleeping on the couch. After a 1975 rebound affair with Marvel fizzled, Kirby turns his attention toward the flowers and cash in animation, leaving many to wonder if the King of Comics had abdicated his throne. Their answer came in 1981 as Captain Victory and the Galactic Rangers, the last chapter of a 30-year triple company Star Gods trilogy, in which the names and shapes of the gods may change, but the authorial intent remains constant. As the series' final issues reveal, the captain is the grandson of the disembodied shadow, Black Mass, a ghost of Darkseid now haunting the pages of Pacific Comics. But of course, this ultimate fate of his New Gods was all just a suggestion, until it wasn't. Now free of the two-publisher system, Kirby had grown less political and more vocal about the disappointment and exploitation in comics. So perhaps as a result of all that barking, DC reapproached him with a chew toy, an offer to redesign his Fourth World characters for the new Superpowers toy line, reprints of his comics to accompany it, and the chance to at last finish his novel. Kirby, however, was now 68 years old. The promise and excitement he'd felt 15 years ago was much harder to grasp. So when his initial proposal for Orion and Darkseid to meet a mutually destructive end in battle was shot down, and compromise after compromise led the project to expand and warp, Kirby did what he always did. He got personal. The penultimate Even Gods Must Die and the Hunger Dogs finale are many things, but chiefly they are a meditation on time and change. As Darkseid nears victory, he's been robbed of the passion of his pursuit by the growing automation of war. Dead characters are returned as mindless husks, and life is ruled by the algorithm. The critique of the heartbreaking industry of comics is obvious, but the hope Kirby ultimately presents rings more honest. By succumbing to the destruction of New Genesis, Highfather inverts the fearful oppression of Darkseid's rule. Desperate to exert some form of control, Darkseid seeks out Orion at last, eager for the final confrontation his son has so long sought. But Orion has found love in the pits of Apocalypse, for both a partner and more importantly for himself. The stalemate that has trapped them in a static, vicious cycle finally over. So that is the primer coat, sort of the essentials that you absolutely must know about New Gods and Kirby's involvement with that series in order to follow me down this tangly, narrow path we're about to go down. Now, many of the thoughts I'm about to share were once part of, or maybe still part of, kind of a semi-abandoned documentary-style look at Kirby's body of work. In specific, how projects like New Gods reflect who he was holistically and creatively as both a writer and an artist. And now, I am not an expert. I am not a Kirby historian. I was not there, despite how white my beard is, I was not there firsthand. I just know what I've researched and what I've gleaned from interviews and the instincts and insights and experiences that I've had as someone who's, let's say, weathered the comics industry. A lot of these initial thoughts took their shape at a time not so long ago when the broader media landscape sort of ignored or gave short shrift to Kirby's contributions, gave him a lesser billing to Stan Lee. But if you know anything about the working method, you may pick a side as to who you think was more important or who you believe to have been driving the bus, but it's hard to see them as anything less than collaborators. Their working method, often called the Marvel method, was something Stan developed as a way to produce the books quickly and take advantage of the creativity. And I don't mean take advantage in the sense of a pejorative, at least not here, but to take advantage of his artist's abilities as storytellers to
and use that to the fullest. And with Kirby, he found kind of the perfect partner. If you search the internet, you will find scans and drawings of Jack Kirby's penciled pages from Fantastic Four, Thor, any other Marvel title, which show the plots scribbled in the margin by Kirby's hand. Now, how those plots came to be may be up for debate. Kirby purists swear it's all Jack's doing. Some people say they hashed things out on the phone, or they played rock, paper, scissors. Or that Stan was more of an editor, a foreman at the Kirby mine, so to speak. Whatever the case may be, they worked together to create the Marvel Universe, and there came a time, as you saw in that video, where they went their separate ways. Now, a big part of Kirby's motivation for moving on from Stan Lee was to show the world that he could do it on his own. He wanted to, as he said, fill his own balloons. To receive credit and compensation commensurate with the level of effort he put into his work. And as you can imagine, there was and still is a lot of political line drawing around any creator moving from Marvel to DC. A lot of people who levy criticisms at Kirby's solo work will use his Fourth World saga as evidence that he needed a heavy hand on the reins, or maybe he just didn't fit at DC, or any number of things. And quite honestly, and I guess obviously by the amount of effort I'm putting into this stupid damn video, I don't agree. I think personal preference and taste is fine and is to be expected. But in this case, I feel the comparisons do both a disservice to some degree. I'm not trying to sit up here like I'm Stephen A. Smith or Shannon Sharp having a talking heads debate about who the GOAT is. I'm simply making a case for Kirby. And at least here, not against Stan Lee. I'm also not trying to sit here and pretend like Kirby's solo work is flawless. The Fourth World is in particular far from that. It is a book in which Kirby visibly strains to balance what it would take to make that series both suitable for a DC superhero audience of all ages and to subvert the tropey might makes right that is typically found in the genre. A lot of times his points are undermined by his fists. His greatest strengths of dynamism and abstraction and emotional physicality lend themselves to conflict as a narrative device. And sometimes he finds comfort in that. Sometimes his strengths, though, tend to pin his aspirations to the mat. When the serial nature of superhero comics intrude on his work, Kirby sometimes seems most at home and other times feels like he's performing a perfunctory obligation. Of course, a lot of that can be pinned on the machinery of DC Comics, but not all of it. So, possibly a good place to start is to attempt to answer the question, what is the Fourth World? At least on a meta level, the Fourth World is a marketing term used to describe the 4 titles that Jack Kirby did for DC. They are Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, Forever People, New Gods, and Mr. Miracle. And no matter what any DC Wikipedia entry tells you, I have a hard time believing that the answer for the question of what the Fourth World is in story can be anything other than simply the Earth. For one, the Earth is the 4th planet in the story, but it is also the stage upon which these eons-old thematic elements that Kirby invents play out. Any other explanation for that, I think, is a little convoluted and honestly pretty fucking nerdy. In fact, Kirby goes to great lengths at the beginning of the first issue of New Gods to set up his creation myth, which entails a world called God World, where the old gods live, that was torn asunder.
God world splits, creating two twin planets, a second and third world called New Genesis and Apocalypse, which pretty much equal heaven and hell. Now, of course, in 2025, there are a bajillion stories in which some great cosmic chaos unfolds on an unsuspecting Earth. But in this instance, I think the choice to go fish out of water was mostly Kirby's concession to the Earthbound superhero universe at DC. See, while it did offer a great deal of creative control, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen was also a title which featured a teenage lead who, though very experienced with weirdness, more or less had his penny loafers firmly on the ground. Jimmy was a fresh set of eyes to take in all this Kirby weirdness with a minimum level of alienation. But by the time we get to New Gods #1, Kirby is pretty frothy-mouthed and eager to throttle his idling muscle car down a flame-stretched highway. We're quickly introduced to Orion, who is one of two new gods through which Kirby intends to sort of thematically explore ideas of reformation, to intertwine and reintegrate the good and evil that he so bluntly halved into the shapes of New Genesis and Apocalypse. These battles wage internally within a lot of his characters, but chiefly in Mr. Miracle and Orion, the sons of Highfather and Darkseid respectively, who were secretly traded between these two warring factions as a pact to keep the peace. However that works. But while it might at first seem heavy-handed to split good and evil into two planets, there's a specific effect to which Kirby's working. Intentional or not, the polarity created by that choice creates pressure from both sides. And a compression that forces Kirby's leads to consider the similarities and hypocrisies of these two warring halves. Kind of a rough-hewn nuance forms out of the necessity of that exploration. In fact, in those initial pages of New Gods, Kirby makes quite a concerted effort to show us, or more accurately to tell us, about Orion's internal dichotomy. Despite being raised on New Genesis, Orion is a soldier who perhaps suspects his true nature as a son of Apocalypse, but has come to believe that he can only be in service of peace through his ability to make war. Fortunately for Orion, this is a Jack Kirby comic, and cosmic forces have literally pointed him in the direction of Darkseid. So he rockets off seeking to confront whatever foul machinations are at play, and only to find his favorite thing, a 2,000-man Hell in the Cell cage match. As he tears through Darkseid's forces, we're introduced to Orion's insatiable appetite for combat, an altar he seems to worship upon, but in fact, what's actually happening here is Kirby has his big meaty thumb placed on the scale. Introducing us to Orion as a feral anti-hero, it's something far closer to a demon or a beast than a man, makes the revelation of Orion's true aspirations, his actual search for purpose beyond being a warrior, take on a more noble and relatable moral significance. Kirby's experiences as a veteran of World War II combat reverberate through every single comic he ever made. Honestly, the man saw and participated in some heavy shit, and it's understandable that he chose his art form to work out those particular demons. But perhaps more so than any of his other books, New Gods is Kirby reflecting back on the impact of war on individuals and communities, and specifically soldiers in peacetime. And in that sense, Orion is almost the perfect bookend to his Captain America. Co-created by pre-war Kirby, Steve Rogers serves as a fantasy or a wish for the shape mankind might take in order to valiantly endure the horrors of war. But Orion is war's ramifications. The haunting memory of the psychological scars and costs of participating in not just a singular war, but a culture of conflict and aggression.
His killer instinct is literally baked into his DNA. That said, the stakes of the war that Orion and New Genesis now wage against Darkseid and Apocalypse are pretty loose in the turns. Darkseid is preoccupied with comics' greatest MacGuffin, the anti-life equation, which is, in rather loose terms, a deadly internet meme existing within the mind of some unwitting edgelord earthling. The anti-life equation would somehow grant Darkseid control over all free will. And the Darkseid that Kirby initially presents is much different than the austere, towering figure of might that we've become accustomed to. Kirby's Darkseid is a schemer. He's a shadowy figure, still plotting and conniving his way towards ultimate power. One happy to sit back in the shadows or perhaps drape seductively across a chase lounge, daring his opponents to make the first chess move. Driven by a preoccupation with his Byzantine scheme to bend free will, Darkseid's only other motive seems to just be fucking with Orion. And though he seems to enjoy and admire the reflection his wayward son casts, it should be pointed out that Darkseid's only internal desire is to be him, to be more Darkseid. When Darkseid does attempt to spell out his motives, his particular mode of elocution is a potent example of one of Kirby's most unique and underrated talents. Biblical and operatic in tone, his oft-derided dialogue is a dynamic and abstract parallel to his art. Much like that art, it can be mistaken for a blunt, curt club when it is in fact more like a baseball bat, a tool abstracted and refined and sanded down to provide both a more specific and varied use. Does it feel dated? Yes. Sometimes he's one keystroke away from calling a machine a robot. But Kirby's scripting style reveals and underscores the intellect of a man who is perhaps very well read, yet self-taught. Though lacking the verbose slickness of Stan Lee, Kirby's dialogue is infused with a poetic ambiguity, which challenges the reader to find their own meaning, to understand that in his stories, things are not going to be quite so simply spelled out as this late-night trip to the killing floor of the comics Waffle House would lead you to believe. Again, that ambition may be a failing, as it sometimes presents his characters as in or ultra-human to some degree. But this search for a balance between high and low creates this odd fusion. Combining words in ways that are familiar yet foreign, Kirby uses language to conjure up all sorts of odd and inventive imagery, like the anti-life equation and Mother Box, Fear Machine, Transylvane, the horror movie planet. But for all his talent at combining words and concepts in strange and creative ways, there are times, particularly in this series, where things feel a little loose in Kirby's grasp. Take, for instance, the Black Racer. Now, I shouldn't have to point out how strange it is that Kirby's Cosmic Grim Reaper arrives on a pair of snow skis. What feels initially like a rather odd misstep is probably just further evidence of Kirby's commitment to using the pages of New Gods to explore the effects of war. Paralyzed, abandoned, and living out his life in the solitude of his mind, Willie Walker feels more like a precursor to 1970s cinema's treatment of Vietnam vets than what you'd typically find in comics. In merging him with the Black Racer, Kirby grants Walker an almost poetic dignity, recruiting a soldier left behind in the cause for a fundamental cosmic power, as if to say that mankind's inability to see this man's worth has nothing to do with his higher purpose or value. But while Kirby grants Black Racer with an almost noble grace, he continues to crash Orion against the rocks of his own craggy soul. Clearly drawn from Kirby's life experiences, Orion hides the transformative effects of war behind a mask of peace. It is, of course, a fear of judgment, a risk of expulsion that drives Orion to hide his true face and to bottle up his feelings. And Kirby astutely implies that Orion's repression only magnifies his sense of helplessness and isolation and rage. But Kirby's thematic explorations were not always so deftly presented. Glory Boat finds Orion and Light Ray on the high seas, battling the monstrous Deep Six alongside a civilian family. And while the chapter is notable for the empathy that Kirby seems to show for the Vietnam-era youth, the pacifist son's noble death takes a very odd turn when Fourth World tech transmutes the boy's dead body into a monster-killing bomb. The muddying of that message calls into question what Kirby meant. Was he trying to portray the duality of war, the necessity of action, the tragic, inevitable pull of violence? But despite these slight missteps, Kirby's New Gods remains committed to portraying a multifaceted view of war. Highfather's obsession with peace is at times played as naivete. Kirby even compared his character to British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, a man he called too moral to act, too worried about peace and preserving the status quo to fight for the future. With Forager the Bug, Kirby shows the victims of a class war that crushes the bugs between the machinations of New Genesis and Apocalypse. In Terrible Dan Turpin, Kirby self-inserts a veteran of seemingly simpler times and wars, No Country for Old Superman-style lawman who wrestles to make sense of the violent weirdness that has fallen out of the sky. And of course, there's Kirby's Oppenheimer, Metron, a character that seems to himself struggle with the burden of his own insatiable intellectual pursuits, but lacks the moral turpitude to put the brakes on them. Metron seems to represent the need to use horrors of conflict as fuel for progress. Flipping back through these issues of New Gods, the overwhelming feeling I walked away with was that of emotional intensity, of the desire to put the issues that were burning at the core of Kirby's mind on the paper. As I've said before, he is not a Swiss watch when it comes to storytelling. But he has a preternatural gift in the ability to make you feel, to literally punch you in the gut with emotion and imagination. And whether or not his work on New Gods was at narrative or conceptual cross purposes, it put on clear display his notions of what superheroes could be, that they could move beyond a simple power fantasy and wrestle with weightier topics. They could be a reflective exploration of the nature of power or the consequences of war and sovereignty and the very nature of good and evil. Was he wholly successful in articulating his thoughts on these things? I don't think so. But again, what Kirby was really best at was planting a seed in your mind and leaving you with an image or an issue that was powerful enough for you to go off and fill the blanks and create your own stories. And perhaps more so than any other comics creator that comes to mind, Kirby's greatest strength was his imagination. I think more so maybe than any other Kirby book, New Gods is about the effects of war on the parts of us that make us human. And nothing makes us more human than our ability to dream. That ability to dream was possibly Kirby's greatest strength and his greatest gift to the reader. And in some ways, New Gods and the whole Fourth World saga is just one big, crazy, messy beautiful dream. So that's my my little dive into the deep end of Jack Kirby's pool for the day. I know I did sort of short shrift to some of the more important individual chapters of that Fourth World saga, like, say, the Pact. But I also kind of wanted to save some meat on the bones so that maybe we can take a more in-depth look at individual issues or series like Mr. Miracle somewhere down the line. I do hope you guys enjoyed this. It was quite an experience to throw this together so quickly and to work from notes on my desk and, just kind of juggling fire. But I think as a man that lived on deadlines, it did Kirby. It would have done Kirby a disservice to do it any other way. Seriously, my fucking desk looks like the Mentaculous. But I think it was worth it. And I hope it gives me enough raw material that I can kind of refine this and make something even cooler out of it in the future. So probably the best way to not miss whatever comes next is to follow whatever social media links and tags I have floating in the immediate vicinity, or more directly to subscribe to the channel by hitting that bell icon. It'll let you know the next time I've uploaded one of these or have plans to do another one of these old Jim Jams. Beyond that, if there's anything specific you'd like me to dig into a little deeper, or you have some requests for me, leave a comment. I'll take it under advisement. So yeah, I hope you guys had as much fun watching this as I had making it. I hope you learned a thing or two. And thanks for helping me bring it to life a little bit. Next time.